For 21 days, the ocean was my world. The silence on the radio was just static, until I pulled up my nets. I thought I'd caught the haul of a lifetime. I was wrong. I'd caught the end of the world. My name is Elias, and for 30 years the sea has been my church, my workplace, and my tomb. I command the Orion, a 70-foot steel-hulled trawler that smells of diesel, salt, and a lifetime of gutted fish. She's no beauty, but she's honest. For the past 2 decades, she's been my only real companion on these long-haul trips into the deep blue off the Pacific Northwest, chasing albacore and the ghosts of my younger self. This last trip was no different. I'd set out for a 3-week run, a deep push into the abyssal plains where the big ones swim. Alone. That's how I prefer it. The sea doesn't make small talk. The first week was poetry. The rhythmic thump of the diesel engine, the cry of a lone albatross, the hiss of the line spooling out into the black water. It's a lonely life, but it's a pure one. The world of men, with its noise and its politics and its endless screaming headlines, feels a million miles away. And for a little while, it was. The silence started on day 8. Usually, I keep the shortwave radio crackling on a low volume, a comforting gibberish of weather reports, shipping chatter, and the occasional burst of music from some far-off coastal station. It's my one thin thread back to the world. But on the morning of the 8th day, the thread snapped. It wasn't a sudden break, it was a fade. The chatter thinned out, replaced by a growing ocean of static. By noon, there was nothing, not a single voice. I wasn't worried, not at first. Solar flares, atmospheric disturbances. The ocean is full of reasons for a radio to go quiet. I checked my equipment. The antenna was secure, the wiring was sound, the unit itself glowed with a healthy green light. It was working. The world just wasn't talking. I spent an hour cycling through the frequencies, from the commercial channels to the emergency bands. Nothing. Just the soft, sibilant hiss of an empty universe. It was unsettling. I'd experienced radio blackouts before, but they were brief, localized. This felt different. This felt absolute. This felt like the world had held its breath. The next few days were the longest of my life. I worked on autopilot, hauling in nets that felt unervingly light, gutting the few fish I caught with mechanical precision. But my mind was on the radio. Every hour, I'd go back to the console, twist the dial, and listen to the sound of nothing. The silence began to take on a physical presence. It filled the cabin, pressed in on the windows. It was heavier than any storm I'd ever sailed through. The sea itself seemed to notice. The water grew still, glassy. The sky was a perpetual, unbroken gray. The birds vanished. I was utterly, profoundly alone in a way I had never been before. It wasn't just the absence of voices. It was the absence of everything. My rational mind, the part of me that had navigated by the stars and survived rogue waves, tried to supply answers. A massive solar storm knocking out global communications. A coordinated cyber attack. A war, maybe, one that had finally pushed the button and silenced everyone for good. Each theory was more terrifying than the last. I tried to hail anyone. "This is fishing vessel Orion. Call sign Echo Lima India Alpha. Does anyone copy? Over." I repeated the call until my throat was raw. My voice, swallowed by the static, was the only human sound for 1,000 miles. And the silence that answered was louder than any scream. I started talking to myself just to hear a voice. I'd narrate my actions. "Okay, Elias, time to check the engine oil. Good work on that net, old man." I even started talking to the boat. "Don't you worry, Orion. We'll figure this out." I was fraying at the edges, the enforced solitude grinding me down into a raw nerve. By day 14, a full week into the silence, a new kind of fear began to creep in. It wasn't the fear of being alone. It was the fear of not being alone. I started seeing things in my peripheral vision, a flicker of movement on the deck, a shadow in the waves that was too big, too fast.
I'd spin around, heart hammering, and find nothing. The isolation was making me a ghost in my own mind. On the night of the 15th day, I was jolted awake by a sound, a low, guttural thrumming that vibrated through the hull of the Orion. It wasn't the engine, it wasn't the sea, it was something else, something deep. I scrambled out of my bunk and onto the deck. The night was pitch black, moonless. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, a bass note that resonated in my bones. And then I saw them. Far off on the horizon, a series of faint, pulsing lights, deep beneath the waves. They glowed with a sickly, bioluminescent green, moving in patterns that were too coordinated, too intelligent for any known marine life. They weren't schools of fish. They were patrols. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my blood running cold, watching those alien lights dance in the abyss. That was the moment I stopped trying to rationalize. That was the moment I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that the world I had left behind 3 weeks ago was gone. And whatever had replaced it was starting to notice me. My fuel was running low, my supplies were dwindling. I had a choice: stay out here and die in this silent, haunted ocean, or turn back. Turn back to a world that had stopped talking.
A world that might not even be there anymore. I chose to go home, or at least to the place where home used to be. I pointed the bow of the Orion east and pushed the throttle forward, running from the silence, from the lights in the deep, and from the terrifying premonition that the worst was yet to come. The journey back was a voyage through a graveyard. The sea, usually teeming with life, was barren. But it wasn't empty. I saw things that had no place in the natural world. On the 17th day, 24 hours into my eastward journey, I saw the first piece of debris. It was a child's rocking horse, the brightly painted kind you see in department stores. It was floating upside down, its cheerful blue runners pointing to the empty gray sky like a silent accusation. I cut the engine and let the Orion drift, watching it bob in the gentle swell. Where had it come from? A cruise ship? A coastal town? There was no wreckage around it, no oil slick, no other signs of a disaster. Just this solitary, impossible toy, 100 miles from the nearest land. It was a message from the world I was returning to, a single, heartbreaking piece of evidence that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. Over the next few days, the flotsam grew more common. It was a bizarre and horrifying parade of the life that was. A half-submerged shipping container, its doors breached, spilling a river of identical blank-faced plastic dolls into the ocean. A grand piano, its wood warped and swollen, listing like a dying whale, its keys playing a silent, discordant melody with the waves. Entire trees, uprooted and stripped bare, their branches tangled with clothes and fishing nets. It was like the world had been picked up, shaken until it broke, and then thrown into the sea. The radio remained silent, but the ocean itself was now screaming with the evidence of catastrophe. I stopped trying to understand it. I just navigated through the debris field, my knuckles white on the ship's wheel, a cold dread settling deep in my gut. I felt like a mariner from an ancient time, sailing into uncharted waters where monsters were marked on the map. Except my map was blank, and the monsters were real. On day 19, I saw the ships. Not the strange lights from the deep, but surface vessels. The first was a luxury yacht, the Serenity, according to the name emblazoned on its stern. It was adrift, its sails torn to ribbons, its deck strangely empty. I hailed it, my voice hoarse. "Yacht Serenity, this is fishing vessel Orion. Do you require assistance?" The only answer was the creak of its mast swinging in the wind. Against my better judgment, I pulled alongside it. The fear of what I might find was eclipsed by the desperate, gnawing need for answers, for another human voice. On day 19,
I saw the ships. Not the strange lights from the deep, but surface vessels. The first was a luxury yacht, the Serenity, according to the name emblazoned on its stern. It was adrift, its sails torn to ribbons, its deck strangely empty. I hailed it, my voice hoarse. "Yacht Serenity, this is fishing vessel Orion. Do you require assistance?" The only answer was the creak of its mast swinging in the wind. Against my better judgment, I pulled alongside it. The fear of what I might find was eclipsed by the desperate, gnawing need for answers, for another human voice.
"Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and weak against the vastness of the ocean. "Is anyone there?" I tied the Orion to the yacht's cleat, and, with a heavy heart and a pry bar in my hand, I jumped aboard. The deck was pristine, eerily so. A table was set for lunch, with plates of untouched food, glasses of wine, and a book lying open, its pages fluttering in the breeze. It looked like the crew and passengers had simply vanished into thin air. I went below deck. The silence was oppressive. The cabins were immaculate, beds made, clothes folded in open suitcases. But in the main lounge, I found the first sign that this was no simple disappearance. There were marks on the floor, dark, reddish-brown smears leading from a locked stateroom door. They looked like drag marks. And on the door itself, there were deep scratches, splinters of wood torn away from the inside. Something had wanted out, or something else had wanted in. I didn't try the handle. I backed away slowly, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I had seen enough. As I untied the Orion, my gaze fell upon the yak's hull, near the waterline. It was covered in strange, pulsating sacs, each about the size of a fist. They were a sickly, translucent purple, and I could see something writhing inside them. A black, filament-like growth, like a cancerous mold, spread out from the sacs, eating into the fiberglass of the hull, covering it in a web of dark veins. I had never seen a barnacle or algae that looked like that. It was alive, and it felt wrong, predatory. I pushed the throttle to its maximum, putting as much distance between me and the Serenity as possible. That night, I didn't sleep. I just watched my radar, and I saw them, dozens of them, blips on the screen, all stationary. A ghost fleet, adrift in the silent ocean. What had happened to them? Had they all seen what I saw? Had they all been boarded by whatever had been locked in that stateroom? Was that same growth now spreading across their hulls too? The world wasn't just silent, it was infected. The ocean had become a carrier, a vector for some unseen plague. The next day, I found the source of the trees. It wasn't a forest fire or a landslide. I passed a small coastal island, or what was left of it. A massive chunk of the island, a good quarter of it, had simply sheared off and fallen into the sea. The cliffs were raw, exposed, as if a giant bite had been taken out of the land. There were no signs of an earthquake, no volcanic activity. It just broke. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was a deconstruction. Something was taking the world apart, piece by piece. My desperation for answers was now warring with a primal instinct to turn the Orion around and head back into the empty expanse of the Pacific, to run until I ran out of fuel and let the ocean take me. But I couldn't. My daughter, Maya, she was in Portland. I had to know. I had to get back. I had to see for myself what had become of our world. I had a picture of her taped to the dashboard, a smiling, gap-toothed 7-year-old from a decade ago. Now she was a young woman, a nursing student, smart, tough, and stubborn, just like her mother. Her mother, who the sea had already taken from me years ago. I couldn't lose Maya, too. The thought of her, the image of her face, became my anchor in this sea of madness. She was my lighthouse, my true north, and I would sail through hell itself to get to her. As I got closer to the mainland, the signs became more overt, more military.
I found a downed F-35 fighter jet, its sleek black fuselage half submerged, its cockpit canopy shattered. A few miles later, an inflatable life raft from a nuclear submarine, empty, but with its emergency supplies untouched and a standard-issue sidearm still holstered to its side. There were deep, gouge-like scratches on the raft's exterior, as if a massive, clawed animal had tried to get at whatever was inside. The final and most chilling discovery came on the morning of day 21, the day I was scheduled to make landfall. It was a buoy, a large, yellow, deep ocean meteorological buoy. But it had been modified. A military-grade camera and sensor package had been crudely welded to its top, and a solar panel was attached to power it. Stenciled on its side in stark black letters was a message that made my blood run cold. Quarantine zone, Tenebris protocol. Do not approach. No survivors. Turn back now. Tenebris, Latin for darkness. Whatever this was, the military had given it a name. They hadn't stopped it. They had just named it, quarantined it, and left it to fester, and I was sailing right into the heart of it. Seeing that buoy, it changed something in me. The vague, formless dread I'd been living with for 2 weeks solidified into a sharp, cold certainty. This wasn't just a disaster. It was an enemy with a name. Tenebris, the darkness. I felt a surge of defiant anger. Turn back? To where? To the silent ocean and the hungry lights in the deep? No, there was no back anymore. There was only through. My fuel gauge was kissing the red line. My fresh water was almost gone. I had one last desperate card to play. I still had my main nets, the big, deep-water trawl net that could swallow a small car. The fish had been scarce, but I was in a deep-sea trench now, one that had always been my secret honey hole.
If there was anything left alive in this ocean, it would be down there. One last haul. That was the plan. Catch enough to fill the freezer, something to barter with if there was anyone left to barter, something to sustain me if wasn't. It felt like a final, desperate prayer to a sea that had suddenly become a god I no longer recognized. I found the spot on my GPS, a place where the continental shelf drops off into a black abyss. I'd always felt a strange reverence for this place. It felt ancient, powerful. Now, it just felt ominous. I slowed the Orion to a crawl and began the laborious process of deploying the trawl. The massive winches groaned as they paid out thousands of feet of steel cable, sending the weighted net on its long journey down into the crushing darkness. On the sonar, I watched its descent, a small blip falling into a vast, empty black. It passed the 1,000-foot mark, then 2,000, then 3,000. Deeper than I'd ever fished before. I was chasing a ghost, a memory of a world teeming with life. I let the net drag along the bottom of the trench for an hour, the cables vibrating with the strain. The engine growled, fighting against the immense weight and the unknown terrain below. Every scrape and shudder sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I was flying blind, dragging a 2-ton net through a landscape I couldn't see, a place where the pressure could crush a submarine like a soda can. What was I thinking? This was madness. A waste of my last precious drops of fuel. I was about to give up, to cut my losses and just make a run for the coast, when I felt a massive jolt. The entire boat lurched and the winch motor screamed in protest, a high-pitched whine of tortured metal. The cable had gone taut as a guitar string. I'd snagged something big. My first thought was a shipwreck or a rocky outcrop. I swore, throttling the engine, trying to work the net free. But it wouldn't budge. The strain on the cable was immense. The needle on the tension gauge was pegged in the red. The winch was about to seize or the cable was going to snap. Either way, I would lose my net, my last chance at a real food supply. I worked the controls, playing the throttle and the winch, trying to rock it free, to coax it out of the abyss.
For a full 30 minutes, I fought with it. The Orion groaned and creaked around me. The smell of burning oil from the winch motor filled the air. And then, just as I was about to give up and cut the line, something shifted. The tension eased just for a second, and then it changed. It wasn't the dead, immovable weight of a snag anymore. It was a live weight. Something was pulling back. A deep, rhythmic, powerful pull that made the Orion list to one side. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. This wasn't a fish.
Not any fish I knew. The biggest thing I'd ever pulled up was a 1,000-pound marlin, and it felt like a minnow compared to this. This felt like I had hooked the sea floor itself, and the sea floor was fighting back. My fisherman's pride, or maybe just my foolishness, took over. I had to see it. I had to know what was on the other end of that line. I engaged the winch, slowly, carefully. The motor protested, smoke pouring from it now, but it held. Inch by agonizing inch, foot by foot, I began to haul my catch up from the darkness. The ascent took over an hour of listening to the straining winch, watching the taut cable slice through the water, and imagining what Lovecraftian horror I was dragging up from the bottom of the world. My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against the slow, steady groan of the winch. As the net neared the surface, the water around the boat began to change. It started to foam and churn. A strange, oily, multicolored sheen spread across the surface, smelling of brine and ammonia and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet, like rotting fruit. And the sound, a low, chittering, clicking sound, like 1,000 insects, was coming from below the waves. The first part of the net breached the surface. It was coated in a thick, black, gelatinous slime that seemed to writhe and pulse in the daylight. And tangled in the mesh were things, pale, boneless creatures like giant slugs, covered in waving, feather-like tendrils. They convulsed and died as the sunlight hit them, dissolving into the same black slime. These were bottom dwellers, things that had never seen the light. But they weren't what was causing the weight. The main body of the net was still below the surface, a huge dark mass that was still pulling, still fighting. I positioned the crane arm over the water, ready to haul the whole mess onto the deck. I had to see, I had to know. The main catch bag, the cod end of the trawl, broke the surface. And I finally saw what I had caught. It was not a fish. It was not a whale or a giant squid or any other monster of the deep I had ever imagined. It was man-made. A cylinder of dark, pitted metal, about 10 feet long and 4 feet in diameter. It looked like a piece of a submarine or maybe a deep-sea probe. But it was the thing that was attached to it that made me stop breathing. Encased in a bulky, old-fashioned deep-sea atmospheric diving suit, the kind with the big copper helmet, like something out of an old Jules Verne novel, was a man, or what was left of one. The suit was ancient, but it was impossibly tangled in the net, held fast against the metal cylinder by the thick mesh. How did it get down there? Who was it? The suit was covered in that same black, veiny growth I had seen on the yacht, but here it was thicker, more virulent. It had completely encased the suit, its dark tendrils worming their way into the seals, into the very metal itself. It pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, the same light I had seen in the deep. My mind was reeling. A diver? Down here? It made no sense. But my questions were cut short by a sudden, violent movement. The figure in the suit, it twitched. A single, sharp, convulsive jerk. I stumbled back from the railing, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. It was alive. After all this time, after being dragged up from the bottom of the ocean, it was alive. My blood turned to ice water. It couldn't be. The pressure down there, the time. There's no way anyone could survive that. It had to be a trick of the light, my exhausted mind playing games on me. I stared at the figure, hanging from the crane in the dripping net, waiting for it to move again. For a full minute, it was still, just a dead weight, a relic pulled from a watery grave. Then it happened again. Another jerk, more violent this time. The copper helmet, clouded and green with age, swiveled slightly, as if it was trying to look at me. A low, wet, gurgling sound echoed from inside the suit, amplified by the metal. It was the sound of water in a clogged drain, the sound of a man drowning, or something worse. A primal fear, cold and absolute, seized me. My first instinct was to cut the line, let it go, let it sink back into the abyss where it belonged. My hand went to the large emergency release lever on the crane controls. I could send this whole nightmare back to the bottom in a second. But I hesitated. That quarantine buoy, tenebrous protocol. The military knew something. They named this thing. This thing in the suit. It wasn't just a victim. It could be a clue. It could be the answer to everything. What had happened to the world? What was this darkness that had swallowed it whole? The answer might be right here, hanging in front of me. Curiosity, the fatal flaw of mankind, won out over fear. I needed to know. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I began to operate the crane, slowly, carefully, swinging the net and its terrifying contents over the deck. I lowered it onto the stern, the heavy metal cylinder and the suited figure landing with a sickening metallic thud that echoed across the silent water. The Orion listed heavily with the new weight. I disengaged the crane and scrambled back, putting the width of the deck between me and the specimen. Up close, it was even more horrifying. The black fungal growth wasn't just on the suit, it was part of it. It had integrated with the metal, its tendrils like a network of wires, all pulsing with that faint internal light. It seemed to be concentrated around the helmet and the chest plate, as if it were feeding on whatever was inside. The suit itself was a relic, heavy copper and brass, thick-paned glass portholes. It was a standard deep-sea suit, but there were modifications. Strange antennae and sensor arrays were bolted onto the helmet, and thick armored cables ran from the suit to the metal cylinder. The cylinder had faded stenciling on it, DSRA-4, Prometheus Project. Prometheus Project. The name sent a shiver down my spine. Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and was punished for eternity. What kind of fire had these people been playing with? The figure inside the suit moved again, a slow, deliberate twist of its torso. One of its heavy, gauntleted hands, trapped in the net, clenched and unclenched. This was no death spasm, this was conscious movement. The gurgling sound from inside the helmet grew louder, more insistent. It was punctuated by a rhythmic, metallic tapping. Tap, 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 tap. It was a code. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was SOS. Tap, tap, tap. Ta, ta, ta. Tap, tap, tap. Over and over. A desperate, frantic plea from inside that copper prison. Someone was alive in there. My fear was replaced by a sudden, overwhelming surge of adrenaline and a sense of duty. I was a mariner, and the first rule of the sea is that you do not leave a man to die. I grabbed a pry bar and a set of heavy bolt cutters from my toolbox. The net was a tangled mess, and the slime that coated it was caustic, smoking and sizzling where it dripped onto the deck. It took me 10 minutes of frantic work, my hands burning from the slime, to cut the figure free from the net. Once it was loose, it lay on the deck, a monstrous, half-organic, half-mechanical golem. The tapping from inside the helmet grew more frantic. The gurgling was turning into a choked, wet scream. It was running out of air, or drowning. I had to get the helmet off. The helmet was held in place by a series of heavy brass bolts. They were corroded, and the black growth had sealed them tight.
I jammed the end of the pry bar into the seam and threw all my weight into it. The metal groaned. The growth seemed to resist, to tighten its grip. I heaved again, my muscles screaming in protest. With a deafening screech of tortured metal, one of the seals broke. A foul-smelling gas hissed out, and a trickle of black, viscous fluid oozed from the broken seam. The tapping inside stopped. For a horrible moment, I thought I had killed him. I worked faster, frantically breaking the remaining seals. With one final Herculean effort, I pried the helmet ring loose. It came away with a sucking, tearing sound.
I lifted the heavy copper helmet off, and I screamed. It was a long, ragged, tearing sound that was swallowed by the indifferent ocean. There was a man's head inside, that much was true, but it was barely recognizable as human. His face was pale and bloated, the face of a man who had been underwater for a very long time. His eyes were gone, eaten away, the sockets filled with the same pulsing black fungal growth. The growth covered his entire head, a living, cancerous helmet beneath the copper one. It had wormed its way into his mouth, his ears, his nostrils. It was breathing for him with a slow, sickening, liquid pulse. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that as I watched, the flesh on his face began to shift, to reform. The bloated, dead tissue contracted, tightened. The gaping mouth, filled with black tendrils, pulled back into a grimace, then a snarl. And from the empty, corrupted sockets, a new pair of eyes began to grow. Not human eyes, but clusters of small, green, bioluminescent lenses, like those of an insect. They swiveled in their sockets, unfocused at first, and then they locked on to me. The thing on the deck, the thing wearing the corpse of a man, looked at me. And in those alien, multifaceted eyes, I saw a flicker of ancient, malevolent intelligence. The mouth opened, and it wasn't a gurgle that came out this time. It was a word, a single, choked, guttural word that sounded like it was dredged up from the bottom of a billion-year-old ocean. Tenebrous, it said. And then it lunged. The lunge was impossibly fast. The creature, the thing wearing the dead diver, moved with a speed and ferocity that defied its bulk and the heavy suit. It shot across the deck like a released spring, its heavy metal boots scraping on the steel. I reacted on pure instinct, throwing myself backwards, tumbling over a pile of nets. The thing's gauntleted hand slashed through the air where my head had been a second before, the metal fingers leaving deep gouges in the wooden railing. It righted itself, its multi-lensed eyes tracking me, its head tilting with a jerky, bird-like motion. The wet, gurgling sound from its throat had changed into a low, predatory clicking. It was sizing me up, hunting me. I scrambled to my feet, my mind a white-hot panic. My boat, my sanctuary, had been invaded. The deck of the Orion, a space I knew better than my own living room, suddenly felt like a cage, and I was locked inside with a monster. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy steel gaff hook. It felt flimsy and useless in my hands. The creature took a step towards me, then another. It was learning how to use its new body, the movements becoming less jerky, more fluid, more deliberate. The black fungal growth on its body pulsed in time with its steps, the green lights within it flaring with excitement. I had to get it off my boat. I backed away, moving towards the stern, my eyes locked on the creature. "Get back!" I yelled, my voice a pathetic squeak. The creature responded with a series of rapid clicks and a hiss of foul-smelling gas. It was enjoying this. I knew nothing about fighting, but I knew my boat. I knew every trip hazard, every low-hanging piece of equipment. I feinted to the left, and as the creature shifted its weight to follow, I kicked a loose coil of rope into its path. It stumbled, its heavy boots catching in the rope. For a second, it was off balance. That was my chance. I rushed forward, Not at the creature, but at the massive metal cylinder it had been attached to. Prometheus Project. Whatever this thing was, that cylinder seemed important. It was still connected to the diving suit by a thick, armored cable. I swung the gaff hook like a baseball bat, aiming for the cable. The hook connected with a shower of sparks. I hit it again and again, putting all my strength, all my fear, all my rage into each blow. The cable was tough, but it was old. On the fourth strike, it severed with a loud snap and a flash of blue electrical energy. The creature shrieked. It was a sound that was both mechanical and organic, a high-pitched digital screech mixed with the cry of a dying animal. The green lights on its body flickered and dimmed. The cable had been a power source, or a leash. The creature looked down at the severed cable, then back at me. The insect-like eyes narrowed. The intelligence was still there, but now it was colored with pure, unadulterated fury. It ignored the ropes and charged, its movements now clumsy but overwhelmingly powerful. It was a battering ram of metal and rage. I didn't have time to run. I just had time to brace myself. It slammed into me, and the world exploded in pain. The impact threw me against the side of the cabin, my head connecting with a steel porthole frame. Stars burst behind my eyes. The gaff hook flew from my hand. The creature was on me, its immense weight pinning me to the wall. Its gauntleted hands closed around my throat. I could smell its breath, a putrid mix of seawater and decay. The multi-lensed eyes were inches from my own, and in their depths I could see swirling patterns, complex geometric shapes that made my head spin. It was trying to show me something, or it was trying to break my mind before it broke my body. My air was cut off. Black spots danced in my vision. My hands scrabbled uselessly at the thick metal arms pinning me. I was going to die. Here on the deck of my own boat, choked to death by a monster from the deep. My hand, searching for a weapon, for anything, brushed against the handle of my filleting knife, which I always kept tucked into a sheath on my belt. It was small, pathetically so, but it was all I had. With the last of my strength, my vision tunneling to a pinpoint, I drew the knife. I couldn't break its grip, I couldn't pierce the suit, but there was one weak spot. The broken neck seal, where I had pried the helmet off. It was a gap in the armor. I drove the knife into the gap, into the mass of black fungal growth and dead flesh beneath. The creature convulsed. The shriek it let out was deafening. It wasn't a sound of pain, it was a sound of surprise and outrage. The pressure on my throat released. It stumbled back, looking down at the small knife buried to the hilt in its neck. A thick, black, tar-like fluid, not blood, oozed from the wound. It touched the fluid with its metal fingers, then looked at me. The fury in its eyes was gone, replaced by something else. A cold, calculating curiosity. As if I were a particularly interesting specimen of insect that had just bitten it. It pulled the knife out of its neck with a soft, wet plop. It examined the blade, then dropped it on the deck. The wound in its neck sealed itself, the black fungal matter knitting together like living tissue. It was unkillable, and I had just made it angry. I used its moment of distraction to scramble away. I wasn't trying to fight anymore. I was trying to survive. I ran for the controls of the trawl winch. The heavy net, the one I had used to bring this thing up, was still lying in a heap on the deck. As the creature turned to follow me, I hit the emergency release for the net boom. The heavy steel arm, which usually holds the net out over the side of the boat, swung inboard with incredible speed. I had timed it perfectly. The boom slammed into the creature's side, sweeping it off its feet and sending it crashing against the railing. It hit the railing with enough force to bend the steel stanchions. For a moment, it teetered there, half on the deck, half over the churning ocean. It scrabbled for purchase, its metal boots finding no grip on the slick deck. Its multifaceted eyes locked with mine one last time. And in them, I saw no fear,
No anger, just a promise. A promise that this was not over. Then, with a final groan of protesting metal, the bent railing gave way. The creature, the monster from the abyss, the harbinger of Tenebris, fell back into the sea and was swallowed by the waves. A stream of black fluid and a few rising bubbles were the only sign it had ever been there. I collapsed onto the deck, my body shaking, my throat raw. I was alive. I had survived. I lay there for a long time, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing. But I was not safe.
I looked towards the east. I could see it now, a dark smudge on the horizon. Land, the coast of Oregon. My ordeal was not over. It was just beginning. I had just delivered the first passenger of the new world to its shores. The sight of land should have brought relief. Instead, it was a new kind of terror. As the Orion chugged its way through the last few miles of open ocean, the scale of the catastrophe became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't just a city that had fallen silent. It was a civilization that had been erased. My destination was a small fishing town, Port Blossom, a place I'd docked at 100 times. I knew its skyline by heart. The old lighthouse, the steeple of the Presbyterian church, the twin smokestacks of the cannery. Now, the skyline was a jagged black silhouette of ruins, partially obscured by a thick, greasy pall of smoke that hung over the coast and stretched for miles in either direction. The smoke wasn't from a single fire. It was from 1,000 fires, burning unchecked. It carried a scent I'd never forget, a sickeningly sweet and acrid smell of burning plastic, chemicals, and cooked meat. I put on a breathing mask, but it did little to stop the stench from coating the back of my throat. As I drew closer, my binoculars revealed the details. The lighthouse was a broken stump. The church was a hollow, blackened shell. The cannery? The cannery was gone, as if a giant hand had simply swatted it from the earth. The entire waterfront was a scene of apocalyptic destruction. Ships were beached at impossible angles, some of them hundreds of yards inland. The marina was a tangled junkyard of shattered fiberglass and splintered wood. And there were bodies. In the water, floating amongst the debris, on the beaches, half buried in the sand. They were everywhere. I felt a wave of nausea and grief so profound it almost brought me to my knees. These were my people. Fishermen, shopkeepers, families I'd known for years. Now, they were just part of the wreckage. I steered the Orion towards the main commercial dock, or what was left of it. Most of it had collapsed, but there was one section that seemed relatively intact. I had to land. I was out of fuel, out of water, and out of time. My desperate hope was to find supplies, find a working vehicle, and begin the 100-mile journey inland to Portland, to Maya. The hope felt thin and foolish in the face of this utter devastation. As I maneuvered the boat, I saw movement on the shore. My heart leaped. Survivors! I grabbed my signal horn and was about to sound it when the binoculars found them again. They weren't survivors, not in any sense of the word. They were people. Or they had been. Now they moved with a slow, shambling, uncoordinated gait. Their bodies were wrong, twisted. Their skin was a mottled gray, and there were patches of that same black, veiny fungus I'd seen on the diver, growing on their bodies like a parasitic vine. Some of them were gathered around a beached whale, tearing at its flesh with their bare hands. Others just stood at the water's edge, staring out at my boat with an unnerving, vacant intensity. The infected, the zombies. The word felt stupid, like something from a movie, but there was no other word for them. This was the Tenebris protocol. This was the darkness on the land. My encounter with the creature on my boat had been a fight for survival. This was different. This was a glimpse into hell. I cut the engine, letting the Orion drift the last 50 feet to the dock. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by the gentle lapping of the waves and a low, collective moaning from the shore. It was a sound of perpetual, mindless hunger.
I had a choice: stay on the boat, a sitting duck with no fuel, or go ashore into that nightmare. It wasn't really a choice at all. Maya, her face swam in my mind. I had to try. I armed myself. I had a hunting rifle, a 12-gauge shotgun, and my sidearm. I wasn't a soldier, but I knew how to shoot. I loaded every weapon, filled my pockets with extra ammunition. I put on my heaviest waterproof gear, not for the rain, but for the blood and whatever other filth I might encounter. I felt like a man dressing for his own execution. I tied the Orion to a rusty cleat on the dock. It felt like a final goodbye. "You were a good boat," I whispered, patting her hull. I stepped onto the dock. The wood was slick with a dark, slimy residue. The air was thick with the stench of decay. The moaning from the shore grew louder, more focused. They had seen me. A few of them broke away from their grotesque whale feast and began to shamble towards the dock. Their movements were slow, clumsy, but there was a relentless, inexorable purpose to them. I raised my rifle, the scope settling on the nearest one. It had been a woman, maybe in her 50s. She was still wearing the uniform of a waitress from the local diner. Her jaw was missing, and a thick strand of black fungal matter was dangling from the wound. I felt a pang of pity. Then I remembered the creature on my boat, the intelligence in its eyes. Were these mindless puppets, or was there something more sinister at play? I didn't wait to find out. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was shockingly loud in the silence. The infected woman's head snapped back, and she went down in a heap. The others didn't react. They didn't scatter. They didn't even seem to notice. They just kept coming. I fired again and again, my shots methodical, aimed at the head. It was the only way to stop them.
Each shot was a small death, an echo of the world that was lost. A fisherman, a mailman, a teenager who couldn't have been more than 16. I was killing my neighbors, or the things that wore their bodies. I cleared a path to the shore, the ground around me littered with still forms. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a butcher. I ran from the docks, heading inland, away from the water. The town of Port Blossom was a labyrinth of death. The streets were choked with abandoned cars, many of them crashed and burned. Bodies were everywhere, in the cars, on the sidewalks, in the doorways of shops. And the fungus, it was here too. Not just on the infected, but on the buildings. Thick, black tendrils snaked up the walls of houses, pulsing with that same sickly green light. It was as if the town itself was being digested. I needed a vehicle. I spotted the town's fire station. Heavy, reinforced doors, and inside, hopefully, a truck. The main bay doors were closed, but the small side door was ajar. I pushed it open, my shotgun at the ready. The inside of the station was dark and quiet. The smell of blood was overwhelming. I found the source in the main common room, the fire crew. There were 5 of them. They had made a last stand here. It hadn't been enough. They weren't shambling. They were arranged, posed almost, sitting around a table as if in a meeting. But their bodies were broken, their chests torn open. And in the center of the table, there was a thing. It looked like a pulsing organic heart, the size of a basketball, made of the same black fungal matter. It was connected to each of the dead firemen by thick, root-like tendrils that burrowed into their chests. It was feeding on them, or growing from them. As I watched, a section of the heart thing pulsed, and a new tendril snaked out, reaching for the empty chair at the table. It was waiting for a new host. It was a nest. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a mindless plague. This was an infestation, an invasion. It was organized. It was intelligent. I backed away slowly, my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. I had to get out of there. As I retreated, my boot knocked over a metal chair. The clang echoed in the silent station. The heart thing pulsed violently.
The dead firemen at the table stirred. Their heads all turned in unison, their dead eyes, now glowing with a faint green light, locking onto me. And from their chests, where the tendrils entered their bodies, new limbs began to sprout. Not arms or legs, but sharp, chitinous, insect-like appendages. This was a new stage of the infection, a new horror. I didn't wait to see what they would become. I turned and ran, the sound of 5 things that used to be men scuttling after me, their new claws clicking on the concrete floor. The apocalypse was far worse than I could have ever imagined. I burst out of the fire station, my lungs burning, the sound of chitinous clicking echoing behind me. I didn't look back. I slammed the side door shut, hoping to buy myself a few seconds. The heavy metal door shuddered with a powerful impact from the inside, then another. They were a lot stronger than they looked. I sprinted across the parking lot, my destination the massive, bright red engine truck parked in the open bay. Its doors were wide open, a silent invitation. The keys, by some miracle, were still in the ignition. I hauled myself into the cab, my heart hammering against my ribs. The door from the station flew off its hinges, and the things that had been firefighters spilled out into the sunlight. They were monstrous, a grotesque fusion of human and insect, their bodies twisted and augmented by the black fungal growth. They moved with a terrifying, scuttling speed, their dead eyes fixed on me. I turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life with a deafening bellow of diesel power. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I slammed the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The massive vehicle lurched forward. I didn't hesitate. I aimed the truck's heavy front bumper at the monster scuttling towards me. There was a series of sickening, wet crunches as I plowed through them. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I just drove. Getting out of Port Blossom was an ordeal. The streets were a maze of wreckage. I used the fire truck as a battering ram, plowing through abandoned cars and makeshift barricades. The infected were everywhere, drawn by the sound of the engine. They swarmed the truck, their hands clawing uselessly at the steel, their faces pressed against the windows, mouths open in silent, hungry screams. It was like driving through a river of the dead. I made it to the highway, the main route that led inland towards Portland. The highway was no better. It was a parking lot of death, stretching as far as the eye could see. Thousands of cars, all stopped, their occupants either dead inside or gone. What had happened here? A failed evacuation? A military roadblock? I had to get off the main road. I found a service road, a smaller, less traveled route that wound its way through the dense forests of the Oregon coast. The forest at least seemed untouched by the plague. It was a small comfort. As I drove, my adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a profound sense of loss. I had survived. I had a vehicle. I was on my way to Maya. But what kind of world was I bringing her into? Or was I just leading her out of one coffin and into another?
I drove for hours, the fire truck's massive fuel tank giving me a range I could have only dreamed of. I listened to the radio, cycling through the frequencies out of habit. It was still silent. Of course it was. I was alone, the only living person in a dead world. Or so I thought. Late in the afternoon, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. It was a sign, crudely painted on a bedsheet and strung between 2 trees. It read, "Survivors, Sanctuary, turn here." An arrow pointed down a narrow, unpaved logging road. Hope. It was a dangerous, unfamiliar feeling. It could be a trap. It could be a trick. Or it could be real. It could be other people, a community, a chance. My rational mind screamed at me to keep going, to stick to my plan. Don't deviate. Don't get distracted. Get to Maya. But the part of me that had spent the last 3 weeks in utter soul-crushing solitude was screaming louder. I needed to see another human face. I needed to know I wasn't the last man on Earth. I made a decision that would change everything. I turned the fire truck down the logging road. The road was narrow and rough, winding deep into the forest. After a few miles, I came to a checkpoint, a barricade made of logs and old cars, manned by 2 people with rifles. They weren't infected. They were alive. A man and a woman, both looking haggard and grim, but undeniably human. They aimed their rifles at my truck as I approached. I stopped the truck and killed the engine, holding my hands up where they could see them. The man approached cautiously. He was my age, with a weathered face and wary eyes. "That's close enough," he barked. "Who are you? Where'd you come from?" "My name is Elias," I said, my voice hoarse. "I'm a fisherman. I just came ashore at Port Blossom." The man's eyes widened. "Port Blossom? You came through Port Blossom? We lost all contact with them 2 weeks ago. We thought everyone there was gone." "They are," I said quietly. The man and woman exchanged a look. "You alone?" the woman asked. "Yes," I said, "I am." "Are you bit?" the man asked, his eyes scanning my body. "Scratched? Any contact with them?" "No," I said, "I'm clean." He seemed to believe me. He lowered his rifle slightly. "All right," he said, "you can come in, but the truck stays here. We're not taking any chances." I didn't argue. I grabbed my pack, my rifle, and my shotgun and climbed out of the truck. They led me through the barricade and into their sanctuary. It was a small logging camp, a collection of prefabricated buildings and trailers nestled in a clearing in the forest. There were maybe 50 or 60 people there. Men, women, children, survivors. They had generators, a water source, and armed guards on patrol. It was a tiny island of civilization in an ocean of chaos. I was overwhelmed. After weeks of silence and death, the sight of children playing, the smell of wood smoke and cooking food, the sound of human conversation, it was almost too much to bear. I was introduced to their leader, a former forest ranger named Sarah. She was tough, no nonsense, and had clearly earned the respect of her people. I told her my story. About the silence at sea, the infected ships, the creature in the diving suit, the nest in the fire station. I told her about the tenebrous buoy. She listened intently, her expression growing more grim with each detail. "The fungus," she said when I was finished. "We've seen it too. It seems to be terraforming the planet, changing it into something else. And the infected, they're not just mindless eaters. We've seen them exhibit strategy, coordination, as if something is controlling them." "I saw it," I said. "The thing on my boat, it was intelligent." Sarah looked at me, her eyes full of a weary sadness. "We've been calling them puppets," she said, "but we don't know who or what is pulling the strings." That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept in a real bed, under a real roof. I was safe. I was with people. But I wasn't at peace. My mind kept going back to Maya. I had to get to her. I told Sarah my plan. She tried to talk me out of it. "Portland is a death trap, Elias," she said. "It was one of the main quarantine zones. The military firebombed large sections of the city before they pulled out. Whatever is left, it's not worth going in there for." "My daughter is there," I said. It was the only explanation I needed. Sarah saw the determination in my eyes. She didn't argue further. "We can't spare a vehicle," she said, "but we can give you supplies, food, water, ammunition, and a map. We've marked the military checkpoints and the areas with the highest concentration of infected." She was giving me a fighting chance. The next morning, I prepared to leave. The survivors I had only just met came to see me off, pressing small gifts into my hands: a warm hat, a pocket knife, a chocolate bar. It was a small, poignant reminder of the kindness and humanity that still existed in this broken world. As I was leaving, the man from the gate stopped me. "Elias," he said, "one more thing you should know. The infected, they're not the only things out there. There are other survivors. Not all of them are friendly.
Be careful who you trust. It was a sobering reminder that the monsters weren't just the ones with the fungus growing on them. I thanked him and set off on foot, my pack on my back, my rifle in my hands. The road to Portland was long and dangerous, but for the first time since the world fell silent, I didn't feel completely alone.
I had a mission, I had a destination, and I had the hope, however fragile, of finding my daughter at the end of it. The mariner had made his choice. I had abandoned the sea, my only true home, for the uncertain and hostile land. I had traded the devil I knew for the devil I didn't. Whether it was the right choice, only time would tell. The first few days on foot were a brutal reintroduction to the world outside my boat. I was a creature of the sea, my muscles tuned to the roll of a deck, not the unforgiving asphalt of a dead highway. Every step was a chore, my heavy pack a constant nagging weight. The silence of the forest was a different kind from the silence of the ocean. It was not empty. It was filled with the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth, the snap of a twig that could be a deer or could be something else. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The map Sarah had given me was my Bible. It showed the main roads as thick red lines, no-go zones, where the infected were known to congregate in massive herds. My path was a spiderweb of back roads, logging trails, and deer paths, a winding, indirect route that added miles but promised a relative degree of safety. Relative being the key word. On the second day, I had my first encounter since leaving the sanctuary. I was following a dried-out riverbed when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, a child's music box playing a tinny, repetitive melody. The sound was coming from a small, overturned school bus, half hidden in a cluster of trees. My guard was up immediately. It was a lure. I knew it was a lure. But the sound of it, that innocent, haunting melody, it pulled at something deep inside me. I crept forward, my rifle raised, using the trees for cover. As I got closer, I could see inside the bus. There was a small, blonde-haired girl, no older than 6, sitting in one of the seats holding the music box. She was crying. "Hello?" I called out softly. "Are you okay?" The girl looked up. Her face was pale and tear-streaked. "I'm lost," she said, her voice a tiny whisper. "I can't find my mommy." My heart broke. All my cynicism, all my hard-earned paranoia, it all melted away in the face of this lost, terrified child. I started to move towards the bus, to help her, to tell her it was going to be okay. And that's when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the reflection on the bus window. Something behind me. I dropped to the ground just as a man swung a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire at my head. The bat whistled through the air where I had been standing. I rolled, bringing my rifle up. There were 3 of them, rough-looking men, their eyes hard and hungry. The man from the gate was right. The infected weren't the only monsters. "Drop the gun, old man," the man with the bat said, a cruel grin on his face. "And the pack, nice and slow." The little girl in the bus was gone. She had been part of the ambush, a decoy. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The world hadn't just been broken, it had been poisoned. I was outmanned and outpositioned, but I had one advantage. They thought I was a soft-hearted old fool. They didn't know I'd just spent 3 weeks sailing through hell. They didn't know I'd fought a monster from the deep and won. I didn't drop the gun. I fired. I didn't aim for the man with the bat. I aimed for the man behind him, the one with the hunting rifle. My shot was true. He went down with a surprised grunt. The other 2 were stunned for a second. It was all the time I needed. I chambered another round and fired at the 3rd man, who was armed with a machete. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make him dive for cover. The man with the bat charged me, roaring with rage. I didn't have time to aim. I just pointed and fired. The shotgun blast hit him square in the chest, sending him flying backwards. I didn't wait to see if they were dead. I just ran. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire, until my legs were jelly. I didn't stop until the sun went down. That night, I didn't build a fire. I ate my food cold, huddled in a thicket of bushes, my rifle in my lap, starting at every sound. The encounter had shaken me more than any of the infected. The infected were a force of nature, a mindless plague. But those men, they had made a choice. They had chosen to become predators, to prey on the last vestiges of human kindness. It was a lesson I wouldn't forget. Trust no one. The next few days were a blur of walking, hiding, and scavenging. I learned to move like a ghost, to read the signs of the new world. A flock of crows circling in the sky meant a fresh kill and a potential herd of infected. A house with its doors and windows intact was probably trapped. The best places to find supplies were the ones people had overlooked in their initial panic. Veterinary clinics, hardware stores, libraries. I found a copy of Moby Dick in one. I took it with me. A reminder of a different kind of obsession, a different kind of sea. I skirted the edges of small towns, watching them from a distance. I saw things that would haunt my dreams forever. I saw a herd of infected, thousands strong, moving like a slow, gray river through a valley. I saw a survivor, a lone woman, trapped on the roof of a gas station, picked off by a new kind of infected, one that could climb. It was like the fungus was adapting, evolving, creating specialized strains to hunt in different environments. I saw the military's handiwork. Entire towns that had been turned into glass craters by airstrikes. Checkpoints on the highway where the battle had been lost, the ground littered with the burned-out husks of tanks and the bodies of soldiers, many of them now shambling among the wreckage, their uniforms tattered, their weapons still clutched in their dead hands. This was the world I was walking into. This was the world I hoped to find my daughter in. The thought was a constant, dull ache in my chest. Was I being selfish? Was I leading myself to a pointless death, chasing a ghost? Maybe Maya was safe. Maybe she had gotten out. Maybe she was in a sanctuary, just like the one I had left. Or maybe she was in Portland, and maybe she was waiting for her father. That was the thought that kept me going. That was the thought that got me through the cold nights and the long, lonely days. Hope, the most stubborn and foolish of human emotions. As I got closer to the outskirts of Portland, the landscape began to change again. The forests gave way to suburbs. The houses here were larger, more modern, and the defenses had been more organized. I saw fortified houses, boarded-up windows, and "looters will be shot" signs. But in the end, it hadn't mattered. The defenses had all been breached. The houses were silent tombs. In one of them, I found a diary. It belonged to a teenage girl named Emily. She wrote about the initial outbreak, the confusion, the fear. She wrote about her family boarding up the house, rationing food, listening to the radio for news that never came. She wrote about the day the infected broke through. The last entry was just a single, shaky, blood-stained sentence. "They sound like Dad." I left the diary there. It was not a story I had the right to carry. Portland was a fortress, and it had fallen. The city itself was visible now, a smudge of smog and ruin on the horizon, bisected by the skeletal remains of its famous bridges. It looked like a patient that had been cut open on the operating table, its insides scooped out, leaving only a hollow shell. And I had to go into the heart of it. My map showed a route that went through the city's old abandoned sewer and storm drain system. It was a risky path, but it was the only way to avoid the main streets, which Sarah's map had marked as a death zone. I found the entrance to the storm drain system in a park on the edge of the city, a large circular concrete tunnel leading down into the darkness. It smelled of damp earth, mildew, and something else, something fetid. The smell of the tenebrous fungus.
It had gotten into the city's water system. Of course it had. I took a deep breath, checked the battery on my flashlight, and stepped out of the light and into the dark. The road to purgatory was over. I was now entering hell itself. The tunnels were a nightmare, a claustrophobic, labyrinthine world of darkness and dripping water. My flashlight beam cut a small, nervous circle in the oppressive black, revealing walls slick with algae and that now familiar black fungal growth. The fungus down here was different. It had adapted to the darkness, growing in strange bioluminescent patterns that pulsed with a faint greenish-purple light. It was beautiful in a horrifying, alien way. The air was thick and heavy, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I had to fight a constant battle against the panic that threatened to overwhelm me, the primal human fear of being trapped underground. I followed the map Sarah had given me, counting my steps, taking careful note of the branching tunnels and junctions. It was slow, painstaking work. One wrong turn could leave me lost in this maze forever. The tunnels were not empty. I found evidence of other survivors who had used this route. A discarded backpack, a hastily scrawled message on the wall. They can see in the dark. A series of arrows pointing the way, ending abruptly at a large dark stain on the floor. And then I started finding the bodies. Not the infected. These were people who had died down here. Some had starved. Some had simply given up. And some had been hunted. I found a small group huddled together in a side tunnel, their bodies torn apart, their bones gnawed clean. Whatever had killed them, it was not the slow, shambling infected from the surface. There was something else down here, something fast, something hungry. The thought made me move faster, my shotgun now held at the ready, my finger on the trigger. My flashlight beam danced nervously from side to side, probing the shadows. Every flicker, every strange shape was a potential threat. I was a fish swimming through a dark, dangerous reef, and the sharks were circling. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a new sound. Not the drip of water. A rhythmic, metallic clanging. It was coming from a large, circular chamber where several tunnels converged. I approached cautiously, my light off, using the faint glow of the fungus to see. In the center of the chamber was a massive pumping station, its machinery long silent, and gathered around it was a group of things. They were human, or had been, but they were different from the surface dwellers. The darkness had changed them. Their skin was pale, almost translucent. Their eyes were gone, replaced by large, sensitive-looking membranes. They were blind, but they weren't deaf. They were making the clanging sound, tapping on the metal pipes with rocks, creating a crude form of sonar, echolocating their way through the darkness. They were diggers, as I later learned they were called, a subspecies of infected, adapted to this subterranean world. They were leaner, faster, and they hunted in packs. I watched them from the shadows, my heart in my throat. They were communicating, using a series of clicks and screeches. They were organized. I had to get past them. The main tunnel, the one I needed to take, went right through the center of the chamber. There was no way around. I waited, watching their patrol patterns, looking for a gap. It was a deadly, silent ballet. They moved with a terrifying grace, their pale forms flitting through the fungal glow. I saw my chance. A brief moment when the two guards at the entrance to my tunnel turned their backs. It was now or never. I took a deep breath and ran. I ran as I had never run before, my boots splashing in the shallow water, the sound echoing in the chamber. It was too loud. The diggers stopped their tapping. The chamber fell silent. Every one of them turned their eyeless faces towards the sound, towards me. A high-pitched screech, a sound of alarm, echoed through the chamber. And then they were on me. They swarmed out of the darkness, their movements impossibly fast, their long, claw-like fingers extended. I fired the shotgun. The blast lit up the chamber, the roar of it deafening. The digger at the front of the pack exploded in a shower of pale flesh and black ichor. The others didn't even slow down. They were a wave of silent, pale death. I fired again and again, working the pump action, backing away down the tunnel. For every one I killed, 2 more took its place. They were fearless. They were relentless. One of them got close, its claws raking across my arm, tearing through my jacket and my skin. The pain was sharp, electric. I screamed, kicking it away. I was going to be overwhelmed. They were going to tear me apart, just like the bodies I had seen earlier. I was running out of shells. I had one last plan, a desperate, stupid plan. I had a flare in my pack. The diggers had adapted to the darkness. Their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. With my left hand, I fumbled for the flare, my right hand still holding the shotgun, firing, keeping them at bay. I found it. I pulled the cap off, my fingers clumsy with fear. The diggers were almost on me. I could smell their sour, grave-like stench. I struck the flare. It ignited with a brilliant, blinding flash of red light. The effect was instantaneous. The diggers shrieked, a chorus of pain and terror. They recoiled from the light, shielding their sensitive, eyeless faces.
The sudden, intense brightness was agony for them. I used their confusion to my advantage. I threw the burning flare deeper into the chamber, drawing their attention. And then I turned and ran down my chosen tunnel, not looking back. I ran until the shrieks of the diggers faded, until my lungs were bursting, until the light of the flare was just a distant red glow. I collapsed against the wall, my body shaking, my arm on fire from the deep scratches. I was alive, but I was wounded. And in this new world, a wound could be a death sentence. I tore a strip of cloth from my shirt and bandaged my arm as best I could. The scratches were deep. I had to hope the digger wasn't a carrier, that its claws didn't transmit the fungus. A foolish hope, I knew. I had to get out of these tunnels. I had to get to the surface. According to my map, I was close. The exit was supposed to be in the basement of a hospital, St. Mary's Hospital, the very place where Maya was supposed to be doing her clinical rotations. The thought gave me a new surge of strength. I was close. I was so close. I pushed myself to my feet and continued on, my pace now a limping, determined shuffle. The tunnels began to change. The rough-hewn rock gave way to smooth concrete. I could see pipes and electrical conduits running along the ceiling. I was under the city now. After another hour, I found it. A steel ladder leading up to a manhole cover. The map indicated this was the service access to the hospital's sub-basement. This was my exit. I climbed the ladder, my wounded arm protesting with every step. I put my shoulder to the manhole cover and pushed. It was heavy, but it moved. With a final grunting effort, I shoved it aside. Light spilled into the tunnel. Not sunlight. The cold, sterile, flickering light of fluorescent bulbs. I pulled myself up and out of the tunnel into a large concrete room. It was a boiler room. I was in the hospital's basement. I had made it. I was in Portland. I was in the lion's den. I listened. The hospital was not silent. I could hear a low, rhythmic thrumming sound. And from far above, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. A woman humming a lullaby. The sound was both comforting and deeply, deeply unsettling. I had found the source of the plague, and I was walking right into it. My journey was almost at an end, for better or for worse. The hospital was a tomb, a clean, sterile, well-lit tomb. The power was still on, running on some kind of backup generator, its hum the only sound in the suffocating silence. The floors were clean, the lights were on, but there were no people,
No doctors, no nurses, no patients. Just an eerie, profound emptiness. But there were signs of the struggle. A bloody handprint on a wall. An overturned gurney.
A single abandoned child's shoe in the middle of a hallway. It was like the Mary Celeste of buildings, a place where life had ceased in an instant. I made my way up from the basement, my shotgun held at the ready. I was looking for the pediatric ward. That's where Maya's rotation was. The thought of finding her, of seeing her alive, was a physical ache in my chest. The humming I had heard from the basement was getting louder as I ascended. It was coming from the upper floors. It was a beautiful, clear voice, humming a simple, familiar tune. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. It was the lullaby I used to sing to Maya when she was a little girl. My blood ran cold. Was it a trap? A coincidence? Or was it her? I took the stairs, avoiding the elevators. The stairwell was where I found the first nest. It was similar to the one in the fire station, but larger, more complex. It filled the entire landing between the 4th and 5th floors, a pulsating, bioluminescent mass of black fungal matter. Its tendrils dug deep into the concrete walls. And it was guarding something. In the center of the nest, there was a person, cocooned in the black tendrils. It was a doctor, his white coat still visible. He was not dead. His chest was rising and falling. He was in a coma, being kept alive by the fungus. He was an incubator. The humming was coming from the floor above. I had to get past the nest. I couldn't shoot it. The sound would draw every infected in the hospital. I had to be quiet. I saw a gap, a small space between the nest and the railing. It was a tight squeeze. I took a deep breath and went for it. I moved slowly, carefully, not daring to breathe. The air around the nest was warm, humid. It smelled of damp earth and something sweet, like honey. As I squeezed past, one of the tendrils of the nest brushed against my wounded arm. I flinched, but it was too late. The tendril seemed to taste the wound. It coiled around my arm, its tip probing the scratches from the digger. And then something strange happened. The pain in my arm, it vanished. I looked down. The black fungal matter was covering the wound, but it wasn't infecting it. It was healing it. The skin was knitting together. The inflammation was receding. The fungus from the nest was fighting the fungus from the digger. It was as if they were two different, warring species. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The tenebrous fungus? It wasn't a single entity. It was a complex ecosystem, and I was in the middle of a turf war. The tendril released my arm, having apparently neutralized the threat. The nest ignored me, its purpose fulfilled. I was no longer a threat. I was inoculated. I didn't have time to process what this meant. I continued up the stairs, my mind reeling. I reached the pediatric ward. The humming was loud now. It was coming from the end of the hall, from the neonatal intensive care unit. The doors were closed. I pushed them open. The room was filled with incubators, the small glass boxes used to house premature babies. And in the center of the room, sitting in a rocking chair, was a young woman with long dark hair. She was humming to the incubators. It was Maya. She was alive. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. "Maya," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. She looked up. Her eyes were Maya eyes. But there was something wrong. Her expression was blank, serene. There was no recognition in her face. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft, ethereal. "You're here. We've been waiting for you." "We?" I asked, my hand tightening on my shotgun. And then I looked into the incubators. They were not filled with babies. They were filled with the same pulsing, heart-like fungal masses I had seen in the fire station. Small, nascent nests. And they were all connected.
tendrils ran from each incubator, across the floor, and converged on Maya. They were plugged into her, into the base of her spine. She wasn't their prisoner. She was their queen, their hive mother. "What is this, Maya?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What have they done to you, Maya?" "They haven't done anything to me, Daddy," she said, a beatific smile on her face. "They saved me. They saved us all." She stood up, and I saw that the fungus was not just connected to her. It was part of her. The black veiny growth snaked up her arms, her neck, pulsing with a gentle green light that matched the rhythm of her heart. "The world was sick, Daddy," she said, her voice now a chorus of many voices, layered and echoing. "It was dying. Tenebris is the cure. It's a new beginning, a new form of life, a perfect connected consciousness. No more pain, no more fear, no more loneliness." She held out her hand to me. "Join us, Daddy. Be part of the family again." I looked at my daughter, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, her mind and body hijacked by this alien intelligence, and I knew what I had to do. This was my choice, the mariner's final choice. Do I join her, lose myself in this monstrous, beautiful hive mind? Or do I fight, even if it means losing the only thing I have left in this world? My hand went from my shotgun to the small filleting knife still on my belt, the knife I had used on the creature on my boat. "I'm sorry, Maya," I said, tears streaming down my face, "but I've always been a man who prefers the silence." Her smile faded. The chorus of voices turned into a single angry hiss. "Then you will die alone," she said. The hearts in the incubators began to pulse violently. The tendrils on her body writhed and thickened.
The final battle for my life and for my daughter's soul was about to begin. The sea had given me a monster. The land had given me an army of the dead. But it was here, in this quiet, sterile room, that I faced the true heart of the darkness. And its face was the face of my own child.